I'm Zach.
And I'm Gabe.
And we're two college students who have a hard time finding easy to understand, non-skewed, and easy to listen to explanations on complicated topics.
So we decided to start a podcast to help explain them. This week, we'll be talking about the history of the census and why it's important.
You're listening to the Explicationists Podcast. The dictionary defines census as, quote, an official enumeration of the population with details as to age, sex, occupation, etc. To understand any topic in greater detail, it is essential to have some sort of historical context. In ancient Greece, there is evidence of multiple city-states conducting censuses.
The Babylonian Empire took the first known census in 3800 BCE. In it, they count things like livestock, food, and trade items. China holds one of the earliest, most accurate recorded censuses in 2 AD.
From India to Rome, in the Middle Ages, Europe and the Middle East conducted regular censuses. Censuses are not just a count of how many people live in a place. A census can also record information about the population of an area.
Things like agriculture, housing, income, business, and even culture has been documented in censuses.
Cultures from all corners of the globe have conducted censuses for almost as long as humans have been able to write.
Article 1, Section 2 of the United States Constitution states, representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included in the Union, according to the respective number. The actual enumerators shall be made within 3 years after the first meeting of the Congress of the United States, and within every subsequent term of 10 years, in such manner as they shall by law direct.
This spells out the power and duty Congress has to count the number of people within the country. Following the independence and creation of our new nation, we needed to know the country's population to know, 1, how many representatives to put in the House of Representatives, and 2, to see what each state owed to pay their respective share of the war.
Shortly after Washington became president, the first census was taken in 1790. The first census counted few things, like the head of household, the number of free white males aged 16 and up, and the number of free white males under 16, in order to know the number of those able to be fit for military service.
It also counted the number of free white females, all other free peoples, and how many slaves were held in that household. The first census took 18 months to finish.
After completing the first census, the returns were posted at, quote, 2 of the most public places to remain for the inspection of all concerned. Unlike our modern census, where results are strictly confidential. The first census counted 3.9 million inhabitants in the United States, but many believe this number was low.
The census results caused the number of members of the House to change from the 65 it was initially set to 105. The Constitution only requires that the country's population is counted. It doesn't state any more or any less. The census of 1790 counted just that, the number of people in the country.
But over time, we realized that we needed more information from our citizens. In 1810, the first inquiry on manufacturing was made in the census. Questions about agriculture, mining, and fishing were added in 1840 and 1850. Eventually, there was too much information that it took too long to process it all.
The temporary offices set up for the census in 1880 and 1890 stayed open for almost the entirety of the decade following that census. In the 1900 census, Congress limited the type of questions added to just asking about population, manufacturing, agriculture, and mortality.
As more technology emerged, many of the questions and topics dropped in the 1900 census reappeared on future censuses.
Initially, the census was done in temporary census offices. The office would open before the census and stayed open, while in that time the census information was tabulated and would close when the work was done.
As more information was collected and the population increased, the need for a permanent census office became more apparent. On March 6, 1902, Congress passed legislation to create a permanent census office within the Department of the Interior.
The new office opened its doors on July 1st, 1902. In 1903, the Census Office was moved to the Department of Commerce and Labor.
When Commerce and Labor split into two separate administrative agencies, the census stayed in the Department of Commerce, where it lays today.
In recent years, the census in the U.S. has become ever more political. Why is that? Well, according to the usembassy.gov, quote, every 10 years, the United States redraws the lines that decide legislative districts at the federal and state levels. Each state has 2 senators in the Senate. Still, the 435 House of Representatives seats is divided among the states based on their population. That means the census, which happens every 10 years and years ending in 0, plays a big role. End quote.
The number of representatives in the House has been at 435 for 91 years. States that gain population faster than others will have more representatives in the House due to the House of Representatives being based on population. In the last census, 7 states lost a seat, while 5 gained one.
See, more seats equals more influence in the Electoral College, which helps determine the presidency every 4 years. We will get into the Electoral College in a later episode, but just note that the total number of representatives plus the 2 senators every state has equals a state's total electoral votes.
When more House members are added, another issue arises, the redrawing of congressional districts. This, of course, can and has led to rampant gerrymandering among state officials. Some states avoid this by using independent commissions or having the courts deal with drawing lines instead of elected officials, but the issue still exists in a few states throughout the nation.
The census can also determine how federal funding is spent over the next decade. Along with redistricting and economic impacts, the census also helps the government and nonprofit organizations determine the need for infrastructure, hospitals, schools, etc.
This, of course, leads to political implications, leading to political difference and discourse, which, unfortunately, more times than not, leads to political strife, which, unfortunately, might not end with the 2020 census.
The importance of the census is best explained by the Census Bureau website. Quote, the census tells us who we are and where we're going as a nation. It helps our communities determine where to build everything, from school to supermarkets, and from homes to hospitals. It helps the government decide how to distribute funds and assistance to states and localities. End quote.
There are 6 main reasons why the census is essential to our country, states and localities. Those reasons are money, planning, emergency response, redistricting, apportionment, and federal surveys. The census totals help determine the federal, state, and local governments and communities' government funding for the next decade.
It's estimated that each citizen receives an average of over $1,000 in cash from the government each year. The census also helps with planning. The data collected helps inform the government, businesses, and nonprofits about population and other types of trends.
For example, the census tells the government where to invest in infrastructure and helps companies know where to build stores. Our decennial census helps in emergency response in both the wake of disasters and in predicting future health trends. As we stated earlier, the count of everyone helps our governments with redistricting.
The census also gives governments the population count of each state, allowing them to reapportion seats in the United States House of Representatives. The data collected by the decennial census provides a base for future federal surveys of the population.
Now, when hearing about the census, a common question from people is, why should I care about and participate in the census? That is a good question. The census is confusing and often convoluted part of the government. But just because it feels illogical does not mean that it is not important for you to participate in. There is the apparent legal ramifications of not participating in the census.
Title 13, Chapter 7 of the United States Code allows the Census Bureau to pursue legal action against those who do not finish the census. There's a $100 fine for non-participation or not finishing parts of the census, along with a fine of up to $500 for those who give false answers.
There used to not only be monetary fines, but there was also a 60-day prison sentence for not completing or not participating in the census, and a 1-year prison term for giving false answers. That's the legal importance of participating, but there are others. Taking part in the census helps to ensure proper representation. Along with voting, the census is one of the best ways to guarantee that you are adequately represented nationally and locally. The census also helps to properly allocate funding to communities for education, healthcare, and infrastructure, among many other things.
We hope you learned something about the census and why it's important to participate.
If you're interested, you can find more information at census.gov. We want to thank you for listening to the Explicationist podcast. And to keep up to date, you can follow us on Twitter at Explicationist. And you can contact us at theexplicationistpodcast@gmail.com.
This has been The Explicationists. Thanks for listening.